Sarah Martinez had always been good with her hands, but she never imagined those hands would one day hold a military sniper rifle. Growing up in a small Texas town, she spent her summers helping her father repair tractors and old pickup trucks. Her steady fingers and sharp eyes made her the best mechanic's assistant he'd ever had. Even better than her 3 older brothers who were always too eager to rush through the job. When she turned 18, Sarah knew she wanted something more than the quiet life her hometown offered. The military recruiter who visited her high school painted pictures of adventure, education, and purpose that spoke to something deep inside her. She enlisted in the Army as a communications specialist, thinking she'd spend her service years working with radios and computer systems, staying safely behind the lines while others faced danger. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was tougher than anything she'd experienced. But Sarah discovered she had a natural resilience that surprised even her drill sergeants. While other recruits complained about the early morning runs and endless push-ups, she found herself actually enjoying the physical challenges. More importantly, she excelled at marksmanship training, consistently hitting targets that gave other soldiers trouble. Her first assignment took her to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, where she joined the 82nd Airborne Division's Communications Unit. The base was massive, home to some of the Army's most elite units, including Special Operations Forces that most regular soldiers only heard whispered stories about. Sarah settled into her routine of maintaining radio equipment, running communication drills, and supporting various training exercises. Life on base was predictable until the day her commanding officer called her into his office with an unusual request. The Navy's Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6, was conducting a joint training exercise that required additional support personnel. They specifically needed someone with communications expertise who also had exceptional marksmanship scores. Sarah's file had caught their attention. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. She would spend 2 weeks at a remote training facility in the mountains of Virginia, helping maintain communication links during a complex urban warfare simulation. The SEALs would be practicing hostage rescue scenarios, and her job was to ensure all radio channels remained clear and functional throughout the exercise. Sarah arrived at the facility on a crisp Monday morning in October. The mountains were painted in brilliant autumn colors, and the air was so clean and thin it made her feel slightly dizzy after months of North Carolina humidity. The training compound looked like a small city, complete with multi-story buildings, narrow alleyways, and even a mock embassy complex surrounded by high walls. The SEAL team members were immediately recognizable, even in their casual training gear. They moved with a fluid confidence that set them apart from regular military personnel. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson, was a tall man with weathered features and calm gray eyes that seemed to take in everything around him, without appearing to stare. During the initial briefing, Sarah learned that the exercise would simulate a terrorist attack on an American embassy in a hostile foreign country. The SEALs would have to infiltrate the compound, neutralize threats, and rescue hostages while dealing with various complications designed to test their adaptability and teamwork. Her role was to maintain communication between the assault teams and their command center from a secure position overlooking the training area. The first few days passed without incident. Sarah set up her equipment in a concrete observation tower that provided perfect sight lines across the entire training complex. From her position, she could watch the SEALs practice their approaches, study building layouts, and rehearse complex entry techniques. She was impressed by their precision and professionalism, the way they moved together like parts of a single organism. Between exercises, some of the team members would stop by her position to check equipment or coordinate radio frequencies. They treated her with the same respect they showed each other, never making her feel like an outsider despite her relative inexperience. Lieutenant Commander Thompson often paused to ask about her background and seemed genuinely interested in her perspective on the communications setup. On Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Sarah was monitoring radio chatter during what was supposed to be a routine infiltration drill, when she heard gunfire that sounded different from the usual blanks and simulation rounds. Through her binoculars, she could see figures moving through the compound who weren't part of the SEAL team, dressed in civilian clothes and carrying real weapons. Her training kicked in immediately. She grabbed her radio and tried to contact the command center, but got only static. The backup frequencies were equally silent. Someone had jammed or destroyed the primary communication systems, leaving the SEAL team completely cut off from outside support during what was rapidly becoming a real emergency. From her elevated position, Sarah could see the situation developing with terrifying clarity. A group of armed intruders had somehow penetrated the supposedly secure training facility and were systematically moving through the buildings where the SEALs were conducting their exercise. The team members, armed only with training weapons and blank ammunition, were walking into what appeared to be a carefully planned ambush. Sarah's hands shook as she tried every communication channel she knew, desperately attempting to reach someone who could send help or at least warn the SEAL team about the danger they were facing. The radio equipment that had worked perfectly for days suddenly seemed useless, producing nothing but electronic noise that mocked her growing panic. Through her binoculars, she watched Lieutenant Commander Thompson's team approach the main embassy building, completely unaware that armed men were waiting inside. The autumn afternoon that had started so peacefully was about to become something much more dangerous, and Sarah realized she might be the only person in a position to do anything about it. The training facility that had seemed so safe and controlled just hours earlier now felt like a trap closing around everyone inside it. Sarah's comfortable role as a communications observer was about to transform into something she had never prepared for, something that would test every skill she possessed and some she didn't even know she had. As she watched the SEALs disappear into the building where danger waited, Sarah made a decision that would change everything about how she saw herself and her capabilities. The quiet range was about to become very loud indeed. Sarah's mind raced as she watched the armed intruders positioning themselves throughout the training complex. These weren't actors or additional trainers brought in to make the exercise more challenging. Their movements were too deliberate, too focused, and the weapons they carried were definitely not part of any simulation. She counted at least 12 men, all wearing dark clothing, and tactical gear that looked military but bore no identifying patches or insignia. The communication equipment around her remained stubbornly silent, despite her increasingly frantic attempts to establish contact with anyone outside the facility. Every frequency she tried produced the same result: dead air or electronic static that suggested sophisticated jamming equipment was being used. Whoever had planned this operation had thought it through carefully, cutting off all outside communication before making their move. From her observation tower, Sarah had a perfect view of the entire compound, including angles and positions that the intruders below couldn't see. She realized this tactical advantage came with a terrible responsibility. The SEAL team was walking into what could only be described as a death trap, and she appeared to be the only person who could warn them. The main embassy building where Lieutenant Commander Thompson's team had entered was a 3-story structure designed to replicate the layout of actual diplomatic facilities. Sarah knew from the briefings that the SEALs were following a specific timeline, moving through predetermined rooms while practicing their hostage rescue procedures. The armed intruders seemed to know this schedule too, positioning themselves to intercept the team at key choke points throughout the building. Sarah grabbed her personal sidearm, a standard-issue Beretta M9 that she'd qualified with but never expected to use outside a shooting range. The weight of the weapon in her hands felt different now, heavier somehow, loaded with the reality that she might actually need to use it to save lives. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, a calmness that surprised her. Moving carefully to avoid detection, Sarah made her way down from the observation tower and began working her way toward the embassy building. She knew the compound's layout well after several days of observation, including maintenance routes and blind spots that the intruders might not have considered. Her communications training had included basic tactical movement, but she'd never imagined applying those lessons in a real-world situation. The autumn air was crisp and still, carrying sounds farther than usual. Sarah could hear voices from inside the embassy building, a mixture of English and what sounded like a foreign language she couldn't identify. The tone was urgent and coordinated, confirming her suspicion that this was a well-planned operation rather than some kind of random attack. As she moved closer to the building, Sarah began to piece together what might be happening. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone had known about the SEAL training exercise and had used that information to plan an attack when some of America's most elite warriors would be present, but unprepared. The implications were terrifying, suggesting inside knowledge and careful surveillance of military operations. Through a ground floor window, Sarah caught her first clear view of the intruders. They were professional soldiers, she realized, Not terrorists or criminals. Their equipment was too good, their movements too disciplined, their coordination too precise for anything else. This was military action, even if she couldn't identify which military they represented. The sound of boots on stairs echoed from inside the building, and Sarah realized the SEAL team was moving to the second floor according to their planned timeline. The intruders were ready for them, positioned at the top of the stairwell with automatic weapons trained on the entrance the SEALs would use. In less than 2 minutes, Lieutenant Commander Thompson and his men would walk directly into a crossfire that would cut them down before they could react. Sarah's training had never covered a situation like this. She was a communications specialist, not a combat soldier, but the weight of responsibility was crushing. 8 of America's most elite warriors were about to die unless she found a way to intervene. And traditional options like calling for backup were impossible with the communication systems jammed. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was going to have to fight. Not provide support or maintain equipment, but actually engage armed enemies in combat to save the SEAL team. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady as she checked her weapon and counted her ammunition. 15 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, and 2 spare magazines on her belt. Not much against 12 heavily armed professionals. Sarah moved to a position where she could see the stairwell through a side window. The intruders were in perfect ambush formation, their attention focused on the doorway where they expected the SEALs to appear. She had perhaps 90 seconds before the trap was sprung. 90 seconds to find a way to even the odds or at least warn the team about what they were walking into. The window she was looking through was partially open, probably for ventilation during the training exercise. Sarah realized it would give her a clear shot at several of the intruders, but taking that shot would immediately reveal her position and draw fire from the others. She would become a target herself, with no backup and limited ammunition against professional soldiers who outnumbered her significantly. But as she watched the intruders adjust their positions for maximum effectiveness, Sarah understood that hesitation would doom the SEAL team. Sometimes being a soldier meant making choices that scared you, meant accepting risks that seemed impossible, but were still better than the alternative of doing nothing while good people died. The sound of the SEALs moving through the second floor grew louder. Sarah estimated they were perhaps 30 seconds away from the stairwell where death waited. Her finger moved to the trigger of her sidearm, and she began to slow her breathing the way she'd been taught on the marksmanship range. The techniques that had made her an expert marksman during training were about to be tested under conditions no instructor had ever imagined. Sarah Martinez, the small-town mechanic's daughter, who had joined the army to work with radios, was about to become something she'd never planned to be, a combat soldier fighting to save the lives of warriors whose skills far exceeded her own. Sarah's first shot shattered the afternoon silence and took down the lead intruder positioned at the top of the stairwell. Her marksmanship training proved its worth as the 9mm round found its target exactly where she'd aimed, center mass, dropping the man instantly. The element of surprise gave her perhaps 3 seconds before the others located her position and returned fire. She used those seconds well, shifting her aim and firing twice more before bullets began shattering the window frame around her. 2 more intruders fell, their carefully planned ambush suddenly thrown into chaos by an attack they hadn't anticipated from a direction they hadn't covered. Sarah dropped below the windowsill as automatic weapons fire tore through the space where her head had been moments earlier. The sound of gunfire had an immediate effect throughout the building. She could hear Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice shouting orders to his team, the confusion evident as they tried to understand what was happening. The SEALs had been expecting a training exercise with blank ammunition and simulated threats, not a real firefight with live rounds flying in all directions. Sarah crawled along the wall beneath the windows, trying to reach a better position while staying out of the line of fire. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her hands remained steady and her mind surprisingly clear. The terror she'd expected to feel was there, but it was pushed aside by a focused determination that surprised her with its intensity. From inside the building came the distinctive sound of the SEALs adapting to the new reality. These were men trained to handle any situation, and even caught off guard with training weapons, they were dangerous opponents. Sarah heard breaking glass and furniture being overturned as they created defensive positions and began to assess their tactical situation. The intruders were shouting to each other in their foreign language, clearly frustrated that their carefully planned operation had been disrupted. Sarah caught glimpses of them through other windows as they tried to reposition themselves to deal with threats from multiple directions. Her unexpected intervention had turned a simple ambush into a complex battle that required them to divide their attention and resources. Moving to a new window, Sarah saw that several intruders were trying to flank the SEAL team by using a maintenance corridor she knew about from studying the building plans. If they succeeded, they would catch the SEALs in a crossfire that even their superior training might not overcome. She had to move again, had to keep disrupting their plans and buying time for the professional warriors to fully adapt to the situation. Sarah sprinted across an open courtyard, drawing fire from at least 3 positions but making it to cover behind a concrete barrier. Bullets chipped stone inches from her head, and she realized how close she'd come to being killed. The intruders were good shots and her luck wouldn't hold forever. But she'd bought the SEAL team precious seconds to understand what they were facing. From her new position, Sarah could see Lieutenant Commander Thompson through a ground floor window. He was moving with the fluid precision she'd observed during training exercises. But now it was applied to a deadly serious situation. Even with training weapons, the SEALs were adapting, using their superior knowledge of close-quarters combat to turn furniture and equipment into weapons and defensive positions. The sound of splintering wood came from inside the building, followed by a grunt of pain and angry shouting. Sarah realized the SEALs were fighting back with whatever they could find, using their hands and improvised weapons to engage intruders who had expected to face targets armed only with blank ammunition. The professional soldiers who had planned this operation were discovering that even without proper weapons, Navy SEALs were extremely dangerous opponents. Sarah's ammunition was running low. She'd used 6 rounds from her first magazine and needed to make every remaining shot count. Through her new window position, she could see 2 intruders trying to coordinate an assault on the SEAL team's position. They were professional enough to use proper cover and movement techniques, but they were also focused on the threat inside the building and not watching for attacks from outside. Her next shot took down the intruder, who appeared to be giving orders to the others. Sarah had learned to identify leaders during her military training, and removing command structure was one way to disrupt enemy operations. The man fell backward and she could see the immediate confusion among his companions as they lost their coordination. The return fire was immediate and intense. Sarah pressed herself against the concrete barrier as automatic weapons fire chewed up the ground around her position. These soldiers were angry now, frustrated that a single opponent was disrupting their entire operation. She could hear them shouting, presumably calling for others to locate and eliminate her. From inside the building came a sound that made Sarah smiled despite the danger, the distinctive crack of a rifle shot that was definitely not from a training weapon. Somehow, Lieutenant Commander Thompson or one of his team members had acquired a real firearm, probably taken from one of the intruders Sarah had shot. The balance of power was beginning to shift. More rifle shots followed, and Sarah realized the tide of battle was turning. The SEALs now had proper weapons and were using them with the deadly efficiency their training had prepared them for. The intruders' careful plan was falling apart, victim of both Sarah's unexpected intervention and the adaptability of their intended targets. Sarah reloaded her weapon with her second magazine, her movements automatic despite the stress of the situation. She had 9 rounds left plus 1 final magazine if needed. The shooting from inside the building was becoming more frequent, suggesting the SEALs had acquired multiple weapons and were pressing their advantage. Through the windows, Sarah could see intruders retreating from positions they'd held just minutes earlier. Some were wounded. Others were simply overwhelmed by the ferocity of the SEAL counterattack once the team had proper weapons and understood what they were facing. The hunters had become the hunted in a remarkably short time, but Sarah knew the fight wasn't over. The intruders were professional soldiers who wouldn't give up easily, and they still outnumbered the defenders. The next few minutes would determine whether her desperate gamble to save the SEAL team would succeed, or whether all of them would die together in this remote training facility. The battle had shifted dramatically in the span of just a few minutes. What started as a carefully planned ambush had devolved into a chaotic firefight that neither side had fully anticipated. Sarah pressed herself against her concrete barrier, listening to the sounds of combat echoing from the embassy building while trying to assess her next move. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice carried across the courtyard, calm and authoritative despite the circumstances. He was coordinating his team's movements, turning their defensive position into an offensive operation now that they had acquired proper weapons. Sarah could hear the difference in their tactics as the SEALs transitioned from survival mode to the aggressive efficiency they were trained for. The intruders were regrouping, Sarah realized, pulling back to defensive positions of their own. Through broken windows and doorways, she could see them establishing fields of fire and attempting to coordinate their response to a situation that had gone completely wrong from their perspective. Their leader was down. Several of their number had been eliminated and their element of surprise was gone. Sarah knew she had to keep moving. Staying in one position too long would allow the intruders to fix her location and coordinate an attack that would overwhelm her limited firepower. She studied the terrain around her, looking for routes that would keep her alive while allowing her to continue supporting the SEAL team's fight. A maintenance shed about 50 yards away offered both cover and a different angle on the embassy building. Getting there would require crossing open ground under possible observation, but Sarah's current position was becoming untenable as bullets continued to chip away at her concrete barrier. She took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever gods protected soldiers in impossible situations, and sprinted for the shed. Gunfire followed her across the courtyard, muzzle flashes visible from several windows as the intruders tried to track her movement. Sarah felt a bullet tug at her uniform sleeve and another kick up dirt inches from her feet, but she made it to the maintenance shed without being hit. Her lungs burned from the sprint and the adrenaline, but she was alive and in a position to continue fighting. From the shed, Sarah had a clear view of the building's rear entrance, which several intruders were using to coordinate their movements. She realized they were planning something, gathering together in a way that suggested a final assault on the SEAL team's position. If they concentrated their remaining forces for one coordinated attack, they might still succeed in overwhelming the defenders through sheer firepower and numbers. Sarah aimed carefully and fired twice, dropping one intruder and wounding another. The shots scattered the group and disrupted whatever plan they'd been forming, buying more time for the SEALs to consolidate their position. Her ammunition was running critically low now, down to her final magazine with only 15 rounds remaining. The sound of helicopters in the distance made Sarah's heart leap with hope. Someone had finally detected that something was wrong at the training facility, probably when routine communication checks failed to get responses. Help was coming, but it might not arrive in time to prevent the intruders from making one last desperate attempt to complete their mission. Lieutenant Commander Thompson appeared at a second-floor window, and Sarah was startled to realize he was looking directly at her position. The SEAL officer had somehow identified where the supporting fire was coming from and was trying to coordinate with her. He raised his hand and pointed toward the building's east side, where Sarah couldn't see from her current angle. Understanding that Thompson was warning her about threats she couldn't observe, Sarah moved again. This time she circled around the maintenance shed to get a view of the building's eastern approach. What she saw made her blood run cold. A group of intruders was setting up what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, aimed directly at the window where the SEAL team had established their main defensive position. Sarah had never engaged targets at this range with a pistol, but she had no choice. The helicopter sounds were getting closer, but not close enough to prevent the intruders from using their heavy weapon to eliminate the SEAL team in one devastating attack. She steadied her weapon against the corner of the maintenance shed, took careful aim at the man operating the launcher, and fired. Her first shot missed, but it was close enough to make the operator flinch and spoil his aim. Sarah's second shot found its target, and the man collapsed over his weapon. The other intruders in the group immediately began searching for her position, automatic weapons sweeping the area where her muzzle flash had been visible. Return fire forced Sarah back into cover, but she'd accomplished her goal. The rocket launcher sat abandoned, its operator down and the remaining intruders more focused on finding and eliminating her than on completing their assault on the SEAL team. Every second she could keep their attention was another second for the approaching helicopters to get close enough to intervene. The distinctive sound of rotor blades was much clearer now, and Sarah could see dust beginning to swirl in the distance as aircraft approached the training facility. The cavalry was coming, but the intruders knew it too. Their window of opportunity was closing rapidly, which made them more dangerous as they became increasingly desperate. Sarah heard Lieutenant Commander Thompson shouting orders to his team, preparing for what might be the intruder's final assault. The SEALs had weapons now and defensive positions, but they were still outnumbered and facing professional soldiers who knew that capture or surrender probably weren't options for them. The next few minutes would determine everything. Sarah checked her remaining ammunition one more time and prepared for whatever desperate action the intruders might attempt. She'd come this far, saved the SEAL team from the initial ambush, and bought time for rescue forces to arrive. Now she had to survive long enough to see the mission through to its conclusion. From her position behind the maintenance shed, Sarah could see the main approaches to the embassy building and most of the positions where the intruders had established themselves. She was running low on ammunition and had no way to resupply, but she was still in a position to influence the battle's outcome. The helicopter sounds were getting much louder now, close enough that the intruders had to realize their time was almost up. Whatever they were going to do, they would have to do it quickly. Sarah steadied her weapon and prepared for the final phase of a battle she'd never expected to fight. The helicopters appeared over the ridgeline like mechanical angels, their rotors churning the autumn air as they approached the training facility at high speed. Sarah counted 3 aircraft, 2 attack helicopters providing security and 1 larger transport that would be carrying additional troops. The cavalry had arrived, but the intruders weren't finished yet. As if triggered by the sight of approaching reinforcements, the remaining intruders launched what could only be their final assault. Sarah watched them emerge from their positions throughout the compound, moving with the coordinated desperation of professional soldiers who understood they had no retreat option. They were going to try to eliminate the SEAL team before the helicopters could land and deploy additional forces. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice carried clearly across the courtyard as he directed his team's response to the assault. The SEALs had turned the second floor of the embassy building into a fortress, using furniture and equipment to create defensive positions that maximized their fields of fire while providing protection from incoming rounds. They were no longer the surprised victims of an ambush, but a coordinated fighting unit operating at full effectiveness. Sarah realized she was in a unique position to observe and influence the final phase of the battle. From her location behind the maintenance shed, she could see approaches to the building that the SEALs inside couldn't monitor effectively. More importantly, she had identified several intruders who were trying to use her blind spots to get close enough for grenades or other close-range attacks. Her ammunition situation was critical now, down to her final magazine with only 12 rounds remaining. Every shot would have to count, but Sarah had proven to herself over the past 20 minutes that she could hit what she aimed at, even under the most extreme stress imaginable. The marksmanship skills that had impressed her drill sergeants were serving her well in actual combat. The first attack helicopter reached the compound and immediately opened fire on intruder positions that were visible from the air. The sound was deafening, a combination of rotor noise and automatic cannon fire that seemed to shake the ground beneath Sarah's feet. Dust and debris filled the air as heavy rounds tore apart the positions where the intruders had been hiding. But several intruders had anticipated air support and chosen positions that were protected from aerial observation. Sarah could see them moving through areas where the helicopter crews couldn't engage without risking the SEAL team inside the building. It was up to the ground forces to deal with these remaining threats. And that meant Sarah still had a role to play. An intruder appeared at the corner of the embassy building, carrying what looked like grenades and moving toward a window where he could throw them into the SEAL team's position. Sarah aimed carefully and fired, her bullet catching the man-center mass and dropping him before he could complete his attack. 11 rounds remaining. The transport helicopter was circling now, looking for a safe landing zone while the attack helicopters continued to engage visible targets. Sarah realized the additional troops wouldn't be able to deploy until the immediate area around the building was secured, which meant the SEAL team had to hold their position for at least another few minutes. Movement to her left caught Sarah's attention, and she saw 2 intruders attempting to approach her position. They'd finally identified where the supporting fire was coming from, and were moving to eliminate her. Sarah shifted her aim and fired twice, dropping one attacker and forcing the other to take cover. 9 rounds left, and she was now under direct assault herself. The surviving intruder was well trained and began using proper fire and movement techniques to close the distance to Sarah's position. She could hear him moving, using cover and concealment while advancing steadily toward her location. Sarah knew she couldn't remain behind the maintenance shed much longer. He would eventually reach an angle where he could engage her effectively. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice rose above the sound of gunfire and helicopter rotors, calling out targets and coordinates to his team and the air support overhead. The SEAL officer was orchestrating a complex battle from inside the building, managing threats from multiple directions while maintaining communication with the arriving reinforcements. Sarah made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her simultaneously. Instead of waiting for the approaching intruder to reach a position where he could kill her, she was going to attack. She'd spent the entire battle reacting to threats and providing support, but now she was going to take the initiative and go on the offensive. Moving around the maintenance shed in the direction opposite to where the intruder expected her to go, Sarah began working her way toward his position. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady and her mind focused. She was no longer the communications specialist who'd been thrust into combat by circumstances. She'd become a warrior in her own right. The intruder appeared around a concrete barrier, his weapon sweeping the area where he expected to find her. Sarah was positioned behind him now, close enough to see the concentration on his face as he searched for his target. She aimed carefully and fired once, ending his threat permanently. 8 rounds remaining. From the embassy building came a sound that made Sarah smile. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was calling for the helicopters to begin their landing approach. The immediate area was secure enough for the reinforcements to deploy, which meant the battle was essentially over. The intruders' mission had failed completely, victim of their own overconfidence and the unexpected variables they hadn't planned for. The transport helicopter began its descent toward a cleared area about 100 yards from the embassy building. Sarah could see fully armed soldiers preparing to fast rope down, bringing overwhelming firepower and numbers that would eliminate any remaining resistance. The professional soldiers who had planned this operation were about to discover what happened when you picked a fight with the United States military on their own training ground. Sarah remained in position, her weapon ready but no longer actively engaging targets. The sound of surrender calls in the foreign language echoed from several positions around the compound as the remaining intruders realized their situation had become hopeless. The battle was over, but Sarah's transformation was just beginning. She was no longer the small-town mechanic's daughter who had joined the army to work with radios. The last 30 minutes had changed her fundamentally, revealing capabilities and courage she hadn't known she possessed. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was about to discover that his communications specialist had become something much more significant, something that would change both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. The silence that followed the battle was almost as startling as the gunfire had been. After 30 minutes of intense combat, the sudden absence of shooting, shouting, and helicopter rotors created an eerie quiet that seemed to press against Sarah's eardrums. She remained behind her cover, weapon ready, until she heard Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice calling her name across the courtyard. "Martinez, show yourself slowly, hands visible." Sarah realized the SEAL officer was being appropriately cautious, ensuring she wasn't an additional threat before exposing his team to potential danger. She holstered her sidearm and stepped out from behind the maintenance shed with her hands clearly visible, calling out her name and unit identification. The professional soldiers now surrounding the compound needed to know she was friendly before someone made a fatal mistake. Lieutenant Commander Thompson emerged from the embassy building, his face bearing new cuts and bruises from the close quarters fighting inside. He was followed by his team members, all of whom looked like they'd been through a serious battle despite having started the day with a routine training exercise. Their eyes were alert and weapons ready, the hyper-vigilance that followed intense combat, clearly visible in their movements. The SEAL officer approached, Sarah with the measured stride of someone assessing a situation that didn't fit any of his previous experiences. Behind him, the reinforcement troops were systematically securing the compound, treating wounded intruders, and beginning the complex process of investigating what had just occurred. The training facility had been transformed from a controlled environment into a crime scene. "Martinez," Thompson said when he reached her position, "I need you to explain to me how a communications specialist ended up conducting a single-handed assault on professional soldiers." Sarah looked into his gray eyes and realized she didn't have a simple answer to that question. Everything had happened so quickly, driven by instinct and training she hadn't known she possessed. The woman who had climbed down from the observation tower 30 minutes earlier felt like a different person than the one standing here now. "I saw them setting up the ambush, sir," she replied. Communications were jammed, and I couldn't warn you through normal channels. It seemed like engaging them was the only option that didn't involve watching your team get killed. Thompson studied her face for a long moment, taking in details that only someone with his level of experience would notice. Sarah's hands were steady despite what she'd been through. Her voice calm and controlled, her posture alert but not defensive. These were the characteristics of someone who had found they could perform under extreme pressure. "How many did you engage?" he asked. Sarah had to think carefully about that question. In the heat of battle, she'd focused on immediate threats rather than keeping score. "At least 6 confirmed, sir. Possibly more that I wounded or forced out of position." One of Thompson's team members approached and handed him a rifle that Sarah didn't recognize. It was clearly military but not American, with modifications that suggested special operations use. The SEAL officer examined the weapon thoughtfully before looking back at her. "This belonged to one of their snipers," Thompson said. "He was positioned to cover their withdrawal route, probably planning to eliminate anyone who tried to pursue them. We found him with a single gunshot wound, fired from approximately 200 meters with a sidearm." Sarah realized he was talking about her final shot, the one that had taken down the intruder trying to flank her position. She hadn't considered the range at the time, focused only on eliminating an immediate threat. The fact that Thompson was impressed by the shot made her understand that she'd accomplished something significant. "I didn't measure the distance, sir," she admitted. "I just saw a threat and engaged it." Thompson nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Martinez, in my 15 years with the teams, I've worked with some exceptional shooters. What you accomplished today with a sidearm under extreme stress against professional operators? That's not normal." The investigation that followed took 3 days and involved personnel from multiple agencies. Sarah found herself debriefed by intelligence officers, military investigators, and specialists she couldn't identify, who asked very specific questions about her observations and actions. The identity of the intruders remained classified, but she gathered from overheard conversations that they represented a significant intelligence coup. Lieutenant Commander Thompson visited her on the final day of the investigation, carrying the foreign sniper rifle she'd seen earlier. He set it down on the table between them and studied her face with the same intensity she'd noticed during their first meeting. "I've been authorized to make you an offer," he said. "The Naval Special Warfare Development Group has a training program for personnel who demonstrate exceptional aptitude under operational conditions. It's not easy, and most people who attempt it don't complete it successfully." Sarah looked at the rifle, understanding that it represented more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of capabilities she'd discovered in herself, skills that went far beyond anything she'd planned when she enlisted in the Army. The small-town mechanic's daughter had disappeared somewhere in the chaos of that autumn afternoon, replaced by someone with very different potential. "What would that involve, sir?" she asked. Thompson's smile was slight but genuine. "It would involve a lot of training with weapons like this one. Learning to use equipment and techniques that most soldiers never see. Working with teams that handle situations other units can't manage." The offer was simultaneously terrifying and exciting. Sarah had joined the military for education and steady employment, never imagining she might have the opportunity to become part of an elite unit. But the events at the training facility had revealed something about herself that she couldn't ignore. "There's something else," Thompson continued. "The program includes extensive marksmanship training with precision weapons. You'd be working with instructors who could help you develop the natural ability you demonstrated here." Sarah picked up the foreign rifle, feeling its weight and balance. It was heavier than her sidearm but felt natural in her hands, as if it belonged there. The scope was more sophisticated than anything she'd used before, but she instinctively understood how it would function. "Would I still be Army?" she asked. "You'd transfer to the Navy, but you'd be working with joint units that include personnel from all services. The missions are classified, but I can tell you they're important and they make a difference." The decision felt enormous, a choice that would determine not just her career, but her entire future. Sarah thought about her hometown, her family, the quiet life she'd once planned. All of that seemed impossibly distant now, separated from her current reality by 30 minutes of combat that had changed everything. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Thompson nodded and stood to leave. "Take your time." "But Martinez, what you did here wasn't just brave. It was exceptional. People with your capabilities have a responsibility to use them." That evening, Sarah sat alone in her temporary quarters. the foreign rifle disassembled on her desk as she cleaned and examined each component. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from years of working on mechanical devices translating perfectly to weapons maintenance. She thought about Lieutenant Commander Thompson's words, about responsibility and capability. The woman who had climbed into the observation tower 3 days earlier had been content to support others, to play a background role in important events. But the woman sitting here now understood that some people were meant for more direct involvement in shaping outcomes. Sarah reassembled the rifle and shouldered it, looking through the scope at the mountains visible through her window. The crosshairs were perfectly aligned, the sight picture clear and steady. In her hands, the weapon felt like an extension of her will, a tool that could reach across distances to protect people who needed protection. The next morning, she found Lieutenant Commander Thompson in the facility's briefing room and told him her decision. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez graduated from one of the military's most challenging training programs and received her first assignment with a joint special operations unit. The range was quiet again, but this time Sarah was the one holding the sniper rifle, her steady hands and sharp eyes ensuring that silence would continue until her mission was complete. The mechanic's daughter from small-town Texas had found her calling in the most unlikely place, and the world was safer because of it.